Please answer.
911, what's the address of the emergency?
Please, Emmanuel Church, there's plenty people shot down here. Please send somebody right away.
Emmanuel Church?
Emmanuel Amy, 110 Calhoun.
And there's people shot?
Yeah, he shot the pastor. He shot all the men in the church. Please come right away.
10 years ago today, Charleston, South Carolina witnessed a moment of evil. In the oldest black church, the South, Mother Emanuel, AME Church, a white supremacist gunned down 9 people bowed in prayer after they had invited him to pray with them for over an hour.
Dylan Roof, the white supremacist who killed 9 black people in a mass shooting in Charleston, had the Rhodesian flag on his jackets and penned an online manifesto which appeared on a website called The Last Rhodesian. There are hashtags on Instagram like hashtag Make Zimbabwe Rhodesia Again, and YouTube videos with comments calling for Rhodesia to return to white minority rule.
Why Rhodesia was a failed state. Rhodesia, for some, that name evokes nostalgia, memories of prosperity and order. For others, it represents pain, land dispossession, second-class citizenship, and brutal repression. The truth? Rhodesia was a society built on racial discrimination. For a tiny minority, there was privilege at the expense of the vast majority. In this video, we're going to unpack the deep differences between black and white life in Rhodesia, also known as Apartheid Light. From land ownership to education, healthcare, politics, and daily life, and show why black empowerment wasn't just inevitable, it was necessary. Because no system that denies justice to the majority can survive forever. Let's start with land, the foundation of wealth in Rhodesia.
Please note, the polite racist colonial condescension.
Cecil Rhodes, the great empire builder, was born 100 years ago. He lies buried in the Matopo Hills in the Rhodesias, which are named after him. This was the country which he brought under the British Crown and formed into a British colony. Wild lands in the heart of Africa, which his vision pictured as the home of a thriving, prosperous people, but populated at that time only by wild beasts and roving tribes.
Please note, the polite racist colonial condescension. Pre-colonial Zimbabweans were prosperous.
Rhodes carved out for himself thousands of miles of land, rich in diamonds and gold, including the ruins of Great Zimbabwe. Claiming it was a Phoenician palace, he oversaw an orgy of looting that robbed these ruins of their most precious artifacts.
Please note, the polite racist colonial condescension. The majority of the artifacts have not been returned.
Now there is an important move afoot to federate the 3 British territories which make up Central Africa, Southern Rhodesia, which has a white population of 150,000, Northern Rhodesia with 45,000 white people and important copper mines, and Nyasaland with 5,000 white people. The object would be to speed development by pooling resources.
Please note, the methodical theft of African land from indigenous black Africans.
This is the second city of Southern Rhodesia, Bulawayo. Here the buildings are going up for the Rhodes Centenary exhibition this year, which will record all that has been achieved in a few generations of progress from primitive tribalism to a modern society.
Please note, the methodical theft of African land from indigenous black Africans.
Yes, I am the Undersecretary for African Land Husbandry. Here in southern Rhodesia, we have 2 million rural Africans who in the past followed the most primitive and wasteful form of subsistence farming. For nearly 30 years, we have been teaching them the basic methods of good husbandry, and our aim now is to provide for them a stable rural economy.
Please note, the methodical theft of African land from indigenous black Africans.
have now decided under the latest amendment to the land apportionment law that 50%, just over 50%, is reserved for Europeans, and only just under 50% is reserved for Africans. If you try to allocate that amount of land per head, there is something like 200 acres per white head in Zimbabwe, and just about 8 acres per black head.
By the mid-20th century, less than 5% of the population, the white minority, stole, not owned, over 70% of the fertile farmland. This happened in the 1930s with the Land Act that favored white settlers. These farms weren't just for food. They were for large-scale commercial operations, feeding exports, tobacco markets, and Rhodesia's economy. Meanwhile, the black majority, nearly 95% of the population, were resettled into tribal trusts by force. These areas were overcrowded, infertile, and deliberately underdeveloped so that families struggled to grow food on this dry, eroded soil, were limited to minimal cattle, while watching trains loaded with tobacco and maize roll past them from white-owned farms, where they worked as indentured servants for peanuts. This was not just an economic system, it was a deliberate policy of dispossession. Dispossession is a state of having something taken away from you, particularly your home or your land.
While not as extreme as the apartheid of South Africa, government policies in Rhodesia were designed to maintain white supremacy through segregation.
For me, a black man was simply a shadow. In fact, it would be difficult for me even to recognize one black man from another in those days. In other words, they were not really people to me. And I guess that was part of growing up. I thought there was nothing abnormal about it. We very seldom met blacks at any level. We were not really aware of what our government at the time was doing to black family life, to the black people of the cities, to the deprivations that they were experiencing, in fact, for the reasons for the war.
In other words, it was theft. And when a system is built on taking away livelihoods from the majority, it creates a pressure that cannot be contained forever. Empowerment became a matter of survival. It needs to be noted that in Rhodesia, racial inequality was not accidental. It was the foundation of the system. The white minority saw themselves as superior, more civilized, and uniquely suited to govern. They often believed black Africans were not ready for leadership, intelligence-based work, nor land ownership. This mindset allowed them to dehumanize and justify the vast economic and social disparities of the black majority. When black people were poor, undereducated, or confined to laboring jobs, white people claimed it was proof of their inferiority, rather than the direct result of land dispossession, segregationist laws, and deliberate underdevelopment. To white Rhodesians, their comfort confirmed their worldview, while black suffering was rationalized as natural, deserved, and even beneficial under their guidance. This is how inequality sustained itself, through arrogance masked as paternalism and oppression disguised as order. This was racism at its core. So what about politics? Rhodesia called itself a democracy, but that was only true for white people. Every white man, and then later white women, had full voting rights, controlled by parliament, the courts, and the police.
Is there ever going to be black majority rule in this country?
Certainly there will be, if we Africans strive long enough. But the trouble is we can't. We're ever suppressed. Each time we try to speak against the government, you might find that you're in trouble within a matter of seconds, which is rather too bad. I mean, they should accept opposition since they're in power. They should always accept opposition from anybody.
Do you think they're foolish not to?
Yeah, that's true. That's true enough.
Do you think then that if they do not accept some form of realistic opposition, hearing realistically the African voice, there is bound to be a violent end to all this?
There's bound to be chaos, that's all I can say. Especially if the African is going to be educated enough.
In a way then, it's in the Europeans' best interests not to educate the African.
You have said that you can't foresee an African government in this country in your lifetime.
That is correct, and I believe that this is on merit. I think these people are a long way away from running countries, from even understanding our system of government, and I believe they are the first ones to concede this. After all, what did it take the Europeans to arrive at their present position?
Ian Smith's Rhodesia said openly that the majority rule would not come in his lifetime, nor in his children's, but history would prove him wrong, because no people will accept being voiceless forever. Black empowerment was the only path to justice. Education is often called the great equalizer, but in Rhodesia, it was the great divider. As for Black Africans, voting was almost impossible. Only a tiny fraction of educated, wealthy Black Rhodesians could qualify under property and income requirements. Imagine being the majority in your own country, but treated as foreigners in the land of your ancestors. This wasn't democracy. It was minority rule, wrapped in colonial arrogance and racism.
Government schools practice strict segregation, though private schools are allowed a percentage of paying black pupils. These boys from Churchill School will probably never play with black school children of their own age, at least not in school. For school sports between blacks and whites are banned by law. Education of blacks to secondary level is considered to be very good, but few of these children will stay beyond the age of 13.
A school in the African township of Highfield, a few miles outside Salisbury.
Good morning, class.
Rhodesia's next generation of Africans are being taught English, the language of their European masters. The teacher is Mary Gabella.
Stand up. Jump. Jump again. Turn round. Turn round again. Now sit down.
White children went to well-funded schools with small class sizes, adequate textbooks and libraries, and teachers preparing them for university. They were groomed to become managers, doctors, farmers, and engineers, at the expense of Black people, while Black children, on the other hand, were cramped into overcrowded, underfunded schools. If they could attend at all, many classrooms had one teacher for 50 or 60 students, with little more than chalkboards and hope. The curriculum for Black students was designed to keep them in menial jobs, farm labor, mining, and domestic service. This was no accident. The Rhodesian system wanted to produce workers, not leaders, among the black population. They were supposed to be servants in perpetuity. But the hunger for knowledge cannot be contained. Many young black Africans resisted, demanded better, and later became the intellectual backbones of the liberation struggle. Empowerment wasn't just necessary, it was unstoppable.
Well, we are totally opposed to the concept of multiracialism because it assumes in the first instance that the people have got to be arranged in compartments based on color. You have Europeans in one compartment, Asians and coloreds in two other compartments, and the Africans in another compartment. And immediately you talk of multiracialism, you are accepting as a starting point that the races are different, and this difference must be recognized. We are non-racialist in our approach. That is, we regard as an individual as an individual, and that everybody must be accorded his full political rights, whether he be white or black, educated or uneducated, rich or poor.
Now let's look at healthcare and daily life. White Rhodesians lived in spacious suburbs with electricity, running water, paved roads, toilets, and modern hospitals nearby. Their life expectancy was comparable to Europeans. While black Rhodesians, they often lived in townships or rural reserves with no running water, poor sanitation, and no electricity. Forget telephones. Hospitals for blacks were overcrowded and underfunded. Infant mortality rates were several times higher, and life expectancy was drastically lower. It was almost like they were designed to die in these reserves. It was literally a system where your skin color determined whether you lived or died. No human being can accept being condemned to shorter lives and poorer quality of life as well as health simply because of race. Empowerment wasn't just political, it was about dignity, survival, and equality in everyday life. And what about jobs?
In 1971, after 6 years of UDI, the new Conservative government went even further. Smith signed a deal with Sir Alec Douglas Hume. They agreed to remove some discrimination against Africans, but leave the whites in charge of the timetable for majority rule.
I'm afraid this is one of our biggest problems because there are so many millions of Africans going through school, and the problem arises where you get an educated African coming out of, say, high school with good O-levels, and there are no jobs for him. I mean, there's so many of them that, you know, right now there's not much we can do about it.
And yet you see, you talk to many adults, and they would deny that this is the situation.
Well, this is only my personal opinion, but I've seen, you know, garden boys with O-levels, sort of thing. It's really sad.
Nephew Josiah is not as fortunate. Despite the fact he's got 5 O-levels, he can't find a job.
Do you do this every day, read the paper, look for a job?
Yes, every day. And nearly every day I write an application letter.
And what happens every day?
Every day I receive a series of regrets.
What about your friends that you were at school with? Are they in the same position as you?
Yes, nobody is employed. I met them, about 70% of them, they are not employed.
70% of the people you're at school with have no jobs either?
Yes.
Smith would go on ruling the country, and Britain would be shot of it.
What do you think the Africans will think of the settlement?
Well, I think they're the happiest Africans in the world.
You think they'll approve of this settlement?
Yeah.
If a black child and a white child emerged from school with similar qualifications, which would find it the most easy to get a job?
Certainly the white man. And to prove that,
few gentlemen, some gentlemen from Salisbury, obviously supporters of the Smith government, came here and we asked them the same question. Why that white men find it easier to find jobs? And obviously they said, just imagine if you had a brother and you were the manager of some company. If your brother and somebody else came, which one would you pick? And obviously the answer was my brother.
But there's still an enormous gulf between the expectations of whites and blacks. Even when blacks are lucky enough to get similar jobs to whites, they get less than half the salary. Though apartheid here isn't as rigid as it is in South Africa, non-whites still can't eat, travel, play or set up home as they please.
In Rhodesia, race dictated your paycheck. Whites held managerial, professional, and skilled trade jobs. They were guaranteed high wages and job security. And even if blacks were offered some of these jobs, apparently they received between 10 to 20% of the comparable wages of a white person. Blacks were kept in the lowest paying sectors by design from this system: farm labor, mines, and domestic service. Even when doing the exact same work, a black worker could earn 10 to 20% of their white worker's wage. To make matters worse, laws restricted trade unions and strikes, keeping the black workforce tightly controlled. This was racial oppression, plain and simple. But history teaches us this: when people are denied fair pay, fair work, and fair dignity, they will eventually rise up. Black empowerment was not a luxury. It was a demand for economic justice. Beyond politics, land, and work, there was the issue of freedom itself. There were past laws that restricted where black Rhodesians could live, travel, or even work. In their own country, entire families were uprooted, forced to move off fertile ancestral land into barren reserves so that white settlers could farm commercially. African culture and traditions were disrespected and dismissed as inferior, while white European norms were enforced. In their own homeland, the majority were treated like foreigners. Empowerment became more than political nor economic. It was about reclaiming identity, culture, and belonging. So, why was black empowerment inevitable? Because you cannot build a nation on exclusion, dispossession, and inequality.
We came from the people, and we fight for the people. We are their sons and daughters in the bush. Those who are going to vote are our fathers and mothers, sisters and brothers. So I think we will win.
What experiences have you had in the struggle yourself?
It's a bitter experience. It's quite bitter. Because the time I left home, I left the village burning. I don't know at present whether my parents are existing or dead. You know, you can see the bitterness in me and the desire for revenge.
An oasis for white supremacy, and expected to last in Africa of all places. For white Rhodesians, It seemed like paradise, but it was a paradise built at the expense of the suffering of millions of Black Africans.
Do your family know what happened to you?
Exactly, I'm going to tell them.
But how and when?
When Zimbabwe is free, when I happen to get them, because I know Smith is bombing at random, so I don't know whether I'll meet them. If I meet them, I will tell them I lost my leg in the battlefield.
For Black Africans, Rhodesia was a prison. And history tells us that prisons don't last forever. The liberation struggle was not just about politics. It was about land, dignity, education, wages, and the simple right to live as full citizens in their own country.
This bangle, I've got the numbers on it. Well, they gave us this bangle. They just want to know where you came from. And they just want to know if you haven't got this bangle, they can say that you are a terrorist. If you have got this bangle, they can say that, well, you are a man who lives in the Cape. But actually, if you've forgotten this thing at home, especially you can say that you have lost your life, because they can shoot you straight, they don't even ask, with this bangle.
So that bangle is your life?
Yes, this bangle is my life.
This keep is not a showcase. No journalists have been here before. This keep is under martial law, like 75% of Rhodesia. Martial law means that the security forces can do what they want. This keep is in a war zone. People are poor and hungry. Sometimes the gates are locked for days on end. People often can't plant their crops or feed their cattle. The new year holds the prospect of starvation.
This is why Black empowerment is not just inevitable. It is necessary for justice, survival, and correcting historical wrongs, as well as the future for Zimbabwe. That is why, despite the challenge that came after independence, the end of Rhodesia remains one of the most important steps in Africa's long march towards freedom.
All right, so story time. I have a teacher. He is Rhodesian, and he left Rhodesia in 1980, 1979 or so. Still calls himself Rhodesian. And his parents moved over there to Rhodesia, currently Zimbabwe, in the 50s. He moved in 1980 because he says the, quote, free and fair elections were not free or fair. To which I immediately replied, I'm sure it feels like that as a Caucasian man, being 5% of the population and realizing that you were about to aggressively lose your power status as an extreme 1 to 19 minority. To which he just blankly stared at me, realizing that I actually knew a thing or two about the situation that he came from.
Zim, you should be poor and asking me for bread.
It's not even like that.
So you realize it's propaganda, and you're right. When they sell Africa out there, it's just poverty. When they sell America and Europe to here, it's just wealth and whatever. But things are not as they seem. Because there's agendas at play, of course.